Co-presented by Panasonic. Create today, enrich tomorrow. Co-presented by Reliance Digital. Technology se rishta jodo.
And welcome. This is a very big year for India from the perspective of foreign affairs. This is the year of the Indian G20 presidency. And to get a sense of how the world outside views India at this moment in the context of the G20 presidency and also in the context of all the global geopolitical and geoeconomic trends that are playing themselves out, I've got a crack panel here at the World Economic Forum at Davos. Let me introduce first Gita Gopinath, Chief Foreign Affairs Editor of the Financial Times. Welcome. Ishan Tharoor from the Washington Post, making his debut on India Today. It's great to have you with us, one of the sharpest foreign policy wonks in India. We've got Samir Saran with us from the Observer Research Foundation, one of the most respected economic pundits in the world, Martin Wolf from the Financial Times. So thank you very much for taking our time. I want to start by focusing on that one big story that's playing itself out, the reopening of China. And we're seeing, because of the fact that China has suddenly reopened its economy, commodity prices are booming, the Chinese economy seems to be on an uptick. I want to start by asking Martin Wolf whether you think that this is temporary, just because they've opened up after being shut for so long. And given how COVID is spreading across mainland China, how do you see things in China at this moment?
Well, one thing I've learnt in the last year or so about China, let mind the world, is forecasting is a mug's game. But I find it very difficult to believe that they're going to reverse what they've now done. I mean, it's been an extraordinary mess, let's be clear, but they're not going to reverse it. And I think they think that the pattern will follow a little bit what happened with India with Omicron, which is there is going to be a huge wave. They're not really going to count how many people died. And 2 or 3 months from now, everybody who could have it will have had it. And then they will be in a herd immunity post-COVID situation, and the economy will expand. I guess, I'm not sure, that the biggest reason they did this is the economy was really in terrible trouble. And for the Communist Party of China, the economy is number one. I think it's the most important issue. And that then links to your other point. Yes, I think this will have a big effect on the Chinese economy and a big effect on the world economy when it reopens for the first time, after all, for 3 years.
Gideon Rahman, Xi Jinping had to encounter protests of a kind that the Chinese state hadn't seen, not since Tiananmen. Some argue that the protests were even bigger than Tiananmen. Is he fully in control once again? Has he quelled the internal turmoil? There's no way of knowing for certain, but what's your best guess?
Well, I mean, I think that, Martin said it was the economy that triggered it. To me, I mean, obviously, sitting outside China, I thought it was the demonstrations as much as that Xi panicked and he reacted very quickly. But, the demonstrations did then quell, and China does have enormous repressive apparatus, which they could have rolled out. So their next question is whether Xi's prestige has been damaged by this very rapid about.
What's your sense? To what extent has his prestige as the supreme leader, the greatest Chinese president of all time, how badly has that been hurt?
Look, I think it has to be, but obviously it's a deeply controlled media environment. There's some discussion on the internet, even that can be managed a little bit. But the question, and the one we really can't answer, is internally in the Communist Party. But on the other hand, if you look at the objective situation, he's just been confirmed for another 5 years, potentially for life. So I think he's still in control, even though it looks like a bit of a mess.
Samir sir, and oftentimes autocrats, when they're in trouble domestically, create national security diversions to try and divert the attention of their local population. Is that a concern for India, given that this is the year of the G20? She could potentially be coming to India in September, but you've got very recently the Indian Army and the PLA square off in Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh.
Look, Rahul, because she plans to come, I am worried. Every time he came, he has brought his army with him. So if you look back in history, he visits India and you have an action on the borders. And this is not once, this is twice.
Sure.
Right? So coming to India should be, anyways, we should be on our guard because he doesn't come alone. Xi Jinping has a habit of bringing trouble with him. And we should be, on alert. But, on the point that Martin and Gideon raised, I think with China, one thing we should have learned by now, I'm not sure we have, but we should all try and imbibe it, that with China, first verify, then trust. I think the notion is absolutely on its head. don't believe any news that comes out of China, even if it is on Western liberal media. Right? I think that is the first precaution we all need to take. They know how to ride borrow the boat to cross the seas, and right now most media in the Western world is compromised. I'm not saying ours is not, but at least we are aware of ours being compromised. There is a virtuous belief that somehow the Chinese are not riding their ship. So I do not believe any news I read coming out of anywhere other than what we hear from folks in that country and in that city, and certainly from our folks who are present there. That's the first part. The second, I think, the news is not Chinese rebound or Chinese virus. The news is that China, more people will die than who will be born this year. And I think that is the inflection point. China is becoming a smaller country and therefore is now going to face new headwinds that they have not experienced before.
You're deriding the Western media, Ishan?
No, I'm not deriding the Western media. I am appraising them in the right manner.
Okay, Ishan, there's a lot of commentary about Xi moderating his positions on wolf warrior diplomacy, on opening up because of the manner in which China saw protests. The counter to that, the likes of Samir would say that this is just very temporary and only because of the protests and only because of the virus. Are you seeing a moderation, or do you think this is just a pragmatic Xi cutting his losses just in this moment and he'll be back to wolf warrior diplomacy the moment he's got COVID under control?
Well, I think certainly the imperatives that come with opening up the economy and projecting a new China post-pandemic on the world stage means a recalibration. And during the pandemic, we saw a hardening of positions both in China but also certainly in the United States. And what's really struck me here in Davos is the gap between the Washington conversation on China and the Davos conversation on China. Here we're talking about the boon to the global economy. We're talking about prospects for 2023 where India is leading the G20 and where we're going to see new forms of regional collaboration and evolution. Whereas in the US, the view on China remains incredibly hawkish. It's a bipartisan consensus in Washington that is uninterested in any narrative about China opening up to the world. And whatever pivots and recalibrations you're seeing from Xi, I know there was a productive meeting between the Americans and Chinese not long ago. You're going to see a visit from Blinken to China soon. But at the same time, I think it's very hard to really give the Chinese that much credit when we've seen such a tremendous geopolitical polarization unfurl.
When an American delegation visited Taiwan, Gideon, we saw the PLN enforce a very strict naval blockade of the Taiwan Straits. There's been a lot of talk about whether she intends to make a go for Taiwan in this presidency, or whether COVID and the slowdown has pushed any Chinese plans to take over Taiwan out into an indefinite future. What's your sense?
Look, I don't think anybody really knows. What you can see is that China has given itself increased military capacity so that they can give themselves an option, they think, to possibly invade Taiwan. You can look at Xi's rhetoric, which has been ramped it up a bit and said, we can't leave this for further generations. But for the rest, I think it's partly speculation. If you talk to kind of Western analysts who get, privileged information, even they don't really know. But I don't think that the consensus is he's going to do it this year. People talk maybe 3 to 5 years. But I think the fundamental uncertainty is that it's a very authoritarian system. In the end, it's Xi's call. As one Western analyst put it to me, even the most senior Chinese we speak to are just messengers to Xi, and Xi makes the decision. And as we've just seen with COVID, he can change his mind pretty quickly.
Martin, how do you see the Chinese economic story play out from here? It's been the most formidable story in the past 3 decades and more. Now, though, post the pandemic, growth much slower than in the past. Many say the idea of the Chinese economy overtaking America may actually never pan out. Are the best days of the Chinese economy behind it or still to come?
Well, I should say one thing about this conversation so far, which is that India's G20 presidency is a poisoned chalice and nothing can be expected of it because it's not because of India's fault, but because the major players disagree so profoundly on everything, including the time of day, as it were, as we've heard. Now, I think that I recognize that I don't understand the security side of China, but I followed the economy for 30 years, really quite closely, and I think I do have a reasonable understanding of the economy. So the difficulties they are in are structural and deep, and they reflect in part the demographic problem, though I think that is exaggerated. We can discuss it in detail. But the growth model they have had, which has been a catch-up growth model based on staggeringly high investment rates, and has really run out of room. The return on investment has fallen very, very sharply over a decade. This is not new. They kept it going with massive infusions of debt. It's one of the most highly indebted countries in the world. It is increasingly being cut off from important technologies from the rest of the world because of US paranoia. And the general tone of China vis-a-vis the rest of the world is seen as increasingly hostile, which makes people very nervous about deepening their connections with them, including in East Asia, including very important countries in East Asia, important partners. All this suggests to me that Chinese growth they will be lucky to do better than 3% or so over the next decade. 3.5%. That's still probably faster than the US, so I think growth will catch up, will continue to occur, but the sort of growth we saw in China up to the financial crisis, up to 2012 actually, is not going to recur.
To what extent do you think, Martin, India is poised to benefit from China's troubles? India is trying very hard through production-linked incentives, through the idea of an Atmanirbhar, self-reliant India to attract international MNCs as they look to diversify their supply chains out of China, partly. Do you think India could be the one big beneficiary, or would benefits get split amongst various countries?
My view is, one, that India really should grow faster than China significantly over the next decade or two. All the potential is there. And two, there is a potential here, but I believe that Indian policy will have to change a lot, and Indian attitudes will have to change a lot. Well, essentially what China did to become China was take some really very radical steps in 20 years ago.
What would you like to see?
Open up the economy, open it to trade, invest massively, just gigantically in trade-oriented infrastructure, provide a very, very comfortable home for MNCs like Apple and so forth to make it the main production base, welcome them, have the most efficient, incredibly efficient support for them. And of course this was helped greatly by the immense influence of the overseas Chinese in this economy. This required a wholehearted discipline, which was a strange combination of bureaucratic centralization with very careful but enormous openness.
Samir?
I don't think, from my following India over the last half century, that India really wants to do that, and I'm not sure that even if it wanted to do it, it can, but it will be a beneficiary. There's no doubt. But you asked, will it be the main beneficiary? I'm not convinced.
Samir, you understand the mind of the Modi government well. There is the reality of an impending general election next year. The fact also that whenever the government has tried to push through tough reform on farm, on land, there's been a big political pushback and out on the streets as well. Do you see the government push ahead with tough economic measures given that we're building into an election year?
So I think, Rahul, let me respond to this in two ways. One, taking something that Martin mentioned, which is fairly accurate. He says that India is unlikely to be or offer what the Chinese offered when they were really opening up and growing. I don't think India is ever going to adopt the Chinese model. It can't, simply because of the very different society, community and country that we are. And we shouldn't. That's the first point. But I don't believe that that is the only template or the one that mercantilist America followed 100 years ago. I think there is an India way. And perhaps when we are sitting here 10 years from now, we might have discovered it. And I can see some elements of it unfold, even as we sit today, which is a sectoral openness. So we'll pick our sectors where we want to engage. So, for example, laying the red carpet out for Apple, or responding to energy, electronic insecurity, diversifying the energy basket, going green, not because of the noise coming from Europe, but because it helps in our energy security program. So you will see an India model which will have a degree of openness, a degree of protection for communities. That's a responsibility. So even as we move to, just so that all of us know, even as we move to a $10 trillion economy in, say, a decade or more, we would still be $6,000 per capita income. So there would be a role of the state to protect those who are in the margins. So we are never going to open up our vulnerable folks to the market forces, because never trust a benevolent politician and a benevolent market. Both of them don't exist. So we will have to have a mix of both, and that is going to be the India model. But we are going to do something different. We are the first economy that is really going to change the nature of who we are in the digital age. Now, the digital age lends itself a very different landscape of possibilities, and India is experimenting with that. India has unleashed the entrepreneurship of small towns, peri-urban centers, agri-retail, and folks under 25 to the extent no other country has before. Now, India is going to be a largely digital story, enabled by the digitalization, by big data availability, by creating solutions for infrastructure that does not exist, using digital means. So I feel that we don't know the India way. I don't think India has fully created a blueprint for where it wants to go. But like everything in India, it is going to be based on massive community participation in its transformation. It is going to be based on strong governments in certain sectors, openness in other sectors, and it is going to be based on, of course, the role of the diaspora, the Chinese. I think that is the common story. We are continuing to see increasing interest by overseas Indians in the India story, sometimes meddlesome, but mostly positive.
A lot of what happens across the world this year depends on the outcome and the future course of the war between Ukraine and Russia. Ishan Tharoor, your sense of where this battle, the war, goes from here? We're seeing the war continue month after month with no immediate sign of closure. Is that the way it's likely to stay through the year?
All signs indicate yes. And, talking about what India does, but as the head of the G20 this year, if you talk to the Indonesians, the war in Ukraine really upset the apple cart for them in terms of their ambitions for the G20 presidency. This is, as you said, a war that has consumed the Western imagination for obviously understandable reasons in many cases. But when it comes to India's interests, and when it comes to the interests of a country like Indonesia, where when they took the mantle of the G20, this was a moment for them to really assert themselves on the world stage in a certain way. This is a multicultural Southeast Asian democracy that has a view of the world that they thought they could bring to bear, and it was completely swept aside by the polarization created by the war in Ukraine. And, that very well may be the case as we watch India take the mantle of G20 leadership. It's not clear what conditions could arise at this point that could lead to a meaningful process of political settlement. And it's not clear where the political will is to push those conditions. And certainly, you saw the Indonesians try to broker something that wasn't particularly meaningful. I doubt that India has any further capacity as well to play a major role on this in the global context. So this is a war that will continue to create ruptures, that will continue to drain economies, and that the U.S. will probably continue to bankroll in months to come.
Gideon, we're also seeing NATO countries arm Ukraine with the kind of weapon systems they earlier said were off the table. To what extent does that increase the prospect of NATO getting further dragged into this war? Do you agree with Ishan where he says it will continue in the same vein? Could it get much worse before it gets better?
Well, I think you're right. There's been a gradual shift. And I think that at the beginning, the NATO countries, and particularly the US, were very conscious of the risk of nuclear war, frankly. They were very worried that Putin would use a nuclear weapon, and they restrained what kind of stuff they were giving. Now you're seeing the British, for example, giving Challenger tanks to the Ukrainians, and hoping that the Germans, who have actually many more attackers, these Leopards, will follow up. And I think it's not that there's no longer concern about Russian escalation, but less. And I tend to agree with Ishan that it looks like a kind of stalemate and a deadlock, but if you talk to some of the Western folk about, well, what is their game plan? their view is that if the Ukrainians can make rapid gains with some of this new equipment in the spring, that maybe you can get it to the point where Putin does decide there has to be peace talks. That would be easy for either side, because the Ukrainians will want to push on to Crimea. I don't think actually the West would back them in that. They'd put the pressure on them behind the scenes. But whether...
It could also lead to an under pressure Putin wanting to escalate further.
Well, exactly. And again, I think there's a slight division of opinion. I think the Americans are a bit more cautious than the Europeans, actually. But the Americans provide all the money and all the weapons, not all of it, but the bulk of it. So even if the Europeans are saying to the Americans behind the scenes, come on, guys, you can be a bit harder, it's actually the caution in the White House which is setting the tone.
Martin Wolf, the big fear in Europe in the winter was that there'd be a massive energy crisis, partly because it wasn't quite as cold as it usually is, and also because of Europe's at this moment it is, and also because of Europe's very quick pivot towards renewables and just energy diversification. Do you think Europe's been able to get past their dependence on Russia?
I think at the moment this winter has gone amazingly well. I mean, it's just amazing. The second point I would make is this reminds me of something I believed ever since the 70s, which is if you really change incentives, it's amazing how well market economies can adjust. And what's gone on in German industry is very, very impressive. And the third is, let's see what happens next winter, because there is gas is still important. There is a question of whether they will be able to fill up the tanks, as it were, the storage over the summer, as well as they did last summer when Putin was still pumping. And if they don't, what next winter will be like. I think people are still cautious about that. But I would have to say right now, things look a bit better than they did a few months ago.
So, I mean, India has been able to maneuver quite smartly, continuing to increase import of Russian oil, and yet somehow not run into trouble with Washington, or at least run into trouble, but just through words, but not in any meaningful fashion. How do you see the Russia-Ukraine war panning out from an Indian perspective?
So let me respond to something Martin said earlier. I think G20 is not easy at this moment. The Indonesians found out, and that is a fact. But also, if there was one G20 country that you wanted to be running the G20 at this time, it is likely to be India. So the good news is that you might see the G20 tide over another year, simply because you have a country like India at the helm, who can both talk to Putin and Washington and have a common sense outcome that takes the G20 agenda forward. So in many ways, while it may be a defensive G20, this also might set the architecture for a world of the future, where polarizations are going to make bodies like this work on some basic common agenda points. And
what do you think can be India's legacy at the G20?
Well, I think there could be three legacies. One, to make sure it didn't end here. That is the first legacy, that it did not end in New Delhi. That is the first legacy. Second, that it takes forward certain common propositions for humankind forward, which is green transitions, which is the development agenda, which is looking at sustainability from a wider lens than just what is spoken about here or in other parts of Europe. That's the second legacy. And the third, and I think this is important, I think the reform of multilateral systems, and I think that's important, whether it's the Bretton Woods, or whether it is how we respond to crises themselves, such as the peace and... The UN is defunct when it comes to peace and security agenda. That pillar is not working in the UN because of the veto system and because of the polarization in the Security Council. That is a lame duck arrangement. So I think it is these informal groupings that will emerge during this G20 presidency, how various countries will be talking to each other to have some sort of an outcome, may give you the format of a networked multilateral architecture where hubs of conversations intersect and create common outcomes. I think that could be the third legacy, smart multilateralism in the network age. But let me just respond to one more point. I think on India has played it smartly. No, India has not played it smartly. India has done what it needs to do for its 1.4 billion people. We were not playing games here. We are not the aggressor. We are not part of the conflict. We have seen countries come into our traditional energy zones and start buying from them. We saw, look, because we are buying from Russia, the energy spikes are not that severe. If we were hunting in the same pools of oil in the Middle East you would see a much sharper rise. We are actually easing the pressure on many others by being able to do this, and they don't have to take the guilt on their conscience. So in a sense, we are the relief mechanism for the virtuosity of the Europeans and Americans, which would have been shattered had we not been doing this. Look who's off taking the refined products. India is not buying their own refined products. It's because it's coming from India. Europe and America are busy buying it. So the fact here is India is doing what it needed to do.
So you're saying Russian oil's getting to Europe after being refined?
I am not doing carbon tracing of each of it.
Yeah.
But the fact is, when you have X amount of oil in the market, and the bulk of it is going to the developed world, guess what is happening here? Yeah. Right? So I'm not tracking each barrel and how it is being produced, but I'm just saying that if the majority of refined products are going to a certain geography, then it is fair to assume that we have eased the energy pressures on those who consume energy, and it's not difficult to do the maths here.
Ishan,
right?
What's the outlook in Washington when it comes to India's G20 presidency, given that the world seems to be what WEF is calling in a state of polycrisis, multiple crises playing out simultaneously?
I'll be completely frank with you and say that Washington doesn't have much of an outlook on India's G20 presidency. The war in Ukraine has really returned us to a kind of Cold War moment in the city where you have a bipartisan embrace of this conflict to a certain extent, of a kind of American role in the world that harkens back to a different era of military intervention and conflict. If there is a significant conversation in Washington about China, it is also a security conversation linked to Taiwan, which has obviously been escalated as a conversation because of the Ukraine war. And I don't think, when we hear Samir talking about multipolarities and the new architectures emerging, that is not something on American radars. And that's probably for the detriment of the U.S. I think there are huge gaps in the way Americans see the world, not least their lack of recognition of the importance of what, in decades to come, the Chinese middle class market, the market represented by the Indian middle class, the tremendous weight they will have on the global system. No one in America is thinking about that right now.
In the few minutes that I have before I wrap up, I want to ask Gideon about this piece that you wrote where you actually suggest that Biden could go down in American history as one of the country's greatest presidents ever. Now, when you see Biden talk, walk, move, that's not really the perception somebody picks up. So argue your case out and then we'll get a counter.
Sure. I mean, he's not a vigorous guy, and all of us are worried about somebody running for a re-election at 82. But if you look at what he's achieved, in domestic terms, he's passed a massive stimulus, massive sort of green energy stuff. He's got a lot more through Congress, actually, than Obama did. And internationally, it was looking terrible for him at the beginning of this year because of Afghanistan. But the way that Ukraine has turned out so far, actually America has rallied America's allies in Europe, in Asia, and it's done it through quite astute diplomacy. And this looks like it could end with a major setback for Russia, and with China looking a bit more cautiously at the world. So if that is his legacy, and I think he sees his legacy as supporting democracy at home and abroad. And you've got to remember, he took power just after the storming of Congress on January 6th. We were all wondering whether American democracy was permanently destabilized. If he can stabilize the United States and reassert democratic values overseas, and I think that is the kind of big picture that's emerging, well, that's a great president.
Martin, do you agree with your colleague's assessment that he could go down in history as one of America's greatest presidents ever?
Well, greatest president ever. There have been so many bad ones. It's not such a difficult challenge, actually. He has been certainly more successful in the last 2 years than I expected. I would add, he beat Trump, even though Trump has never admitted it, and the midterms were a remarkable success from his point of view. I mean, they had the smallest swing against them, I think, of any party for 40 years, 50 years? Gideon would know exactly. So politically, he has been incredibly successful, much more successful than anybody would have imagined. And internationally, I think he's actually had a bit of luck because, well, actually, I'm rather frightened with where the US is a Manichaean power, and it really likes enemies, and they've got them. two great big juicy ones together, and Biden has responded to that far better than Trump would ever have done, or Obama for that matter, so that he's got luck too. So I think it's a reasonable chance that his presidency, will go down as really rather surprisingly successful.
Ishan, you're looking forward to the prospect of an 82-year-old seeking re-election?
Well, a week in Washington is a year, so we're still further away from that. But absolutely, the way Biden has galvanized the transatlantic alliance, every European diplomat you talk to in Washington has been thrilled with the way he's conducted himself and managed the conflict in Ukraine. But going forward, we're one election cycle away from another return to the conversations about the threats facing American democracy, the polarization of the country, the advance of various far-right forces that are reshaping at least one wing of American politics, and that is all with us still. So while we can praise Biden for achieving some genuinely substantive things, America's not out of the woods yet in terms of its political right.
While Biden's trying to set the American house in order, a person of Indian origin seems to be setting Britain in order at last. Gideon Rachman, what do you think about Rishi Sunak? A lot of interest back home in what he's not really of Indian origin directly, just very distantly, but the Indians love him and they say, okay, here's a brown man, he's showing the Brits how to run their country in an orderly fashion.
Yeah, well, we think of him as British, so we don't think of he's showing the Brits how to do this. But yeah, I think he's got off to... Look, there are two things. His political situation is terrible in the sense the Tories are way behind. He'll probably lose the next election unless he's a miraculously successful Prime Minister. But if you talk to like civil servants who'd have to try and make the government run, they are immensely relieved to have him in control after the chaos of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, simply for basic things like he starts meetings on time, he ends them on time, he's read the papers, he asks intelligent questions, and he makes a decision. And that should be taken as read, but believe me, it wasn't in Britain. So that's an advance.
What do you think of how Rishi is doing?
I would emphasize, because this surprises me so much, but if you look at this Conservative government, this really is multiracial. It's been a complete transformation. I think we should get over this sort of question. Britain has become quite a different country. It's not Sajid Javid and Zawari and so many of them.
And Suella
Braverman and Kemi, but much more so actually than Labour. I think this is fascinating, but you can see it in the city.
You two think he could lose?
You can see it in the city. Now, on Richie, my view, met him and talked to him, he's sane. He's reasonably well informed and he works hard. And this is wonderful. Great relief from his two predecessors. In fact, unfortunately, at the moment, I don't think we'll see that he's a great politician. And politics, as you know, with somebody like Modi, who worries me often, but politics is something else. You have to tell a story to the public that they will buy. And Boris was good at that. He was bad at everything else, but he was good at that. I'm not clear that Rishi Sunak can do that. And that means he can be competent, which is wonderful, but he can't be transformative, and I'm not sure he will last.
Oh, you do think...
Because I think the overwhelming probability is the British public will say, we've had 13 or 14 years of these people, they made a terrible mess of it, and they have, and we want them gone.
Ishan, now that's interesting. Indians laying distant claim to Rishi Sunak. The British saying, hey, he's as British gets. Not really, but he's British enough for us to have him as Prime Minister. How are you seeing the Sunak Prime Ministership play out?
I think there was, when he, through the machinations of the Tory party, came to power, I think there was a lot of hyperbole about how he's the British Obama. It's kind of big win for an identitarian view of things. And I'm quite pleased by the fact that, at least in the British conversation, viewing it from afar, the identity politics dimension of this has not mattered very much, and it doesn't matter very much. And what's much more present is the class understanding of where he's from, his privilege, his career as a hedge fund guy and financier, and how that has so much more to bear on the political conversation than where his parents come from, where his grandparents came from. I think it's something you see in the U.S. as well. There's tremendous excitement in India about certain Indian American origin politicians, but I don't think if you talk to a lot of the Indian American origin politicians there as well, they feel the weight of their culture or cultural background as heavily as it's viewed in India.
So one very quick final question from all our guests. I'll start from here. What's it that worries you the most this year?
God, there's a lot to worry about, but I think the Ukraine war, I mean, it could go wrong in many, many ways, and it's going wrong every day because there's sort of brutality being committed on the ground, and there's tragic stuff that's still happening there, and it could get worse.
Samir, the one unknown that worries you the most?
Well, indirectly the Ukraine war, but directly it's the apathy of those busy with conducting the war on some of the more important matters that we are confronted with, climate change and development. And I think indirectly it means that they are so preoccupied that they do not realize that the greater battle is happening somewhere else.
Ishan?
I would say this is maybe a cop-out. I would say just the steady advance of climate change. Every year we're seeing devastating new effects of a warming planet, and I think it's only going to get worse. And even in the United States, it's really testing the badly repaired infrastructure that exists already. So I would worry more about the horrors that we're going to see caused by the warming planet.
Sabul?
Both. Short term, an era of war is an era of massive unpredictability, and it can go anywhere. I think it's a low chance it ends the world, but it could. It could. They've got two powers here with 10,000 nuclear warheads between them. This isn't a joke. And the second point is just in the long term, climate, development, sustainability is the core challenge of our generation.
The world is caught at this moment in a hot war that doesn't seem to be getting over, and a cold war that's just beginning to take shape, which could set the tone for the next several decades. We've had a very sharp and incisive conversation with some very astute minds. Now, thank you all for joining me in this freezing weather here in Davos. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
News is about putting people first,
Just look at the queues right across.
about asking the right questions to those in power.
It takes no sides. माँ का दर्द एक दर्द कोई नहीं समझ सकता उस दर्द को.
It reveals, it heals.
Angry people came out on the streets.
Is this the kind of justice system we want in this country? News is all heart and no hatred.
बिल्किस बानो आज क्या कहना चाहेगी आप?
हमारे साथ जो हुआ है किसी के साथ भी नहीं होना चाहिए.
Experience the news. With me, Rajdeep Sardesai, only on India Today.
सरप्राइज. साले पुरानी दिल्ली के कटर की पैदाइश जब देखो इस फैमिली को बचाने आ जाता है. तेरा इस औरत से रिश्ता क्या है? एक बच्चे का पहला घर, एक लड़के का पहला प्यार, इस दुनिया का सबसे पवित्र रिश्ता. क्या एक्शन के बीच में कहानी मत पूछ.
2022 was undoubtedly a great one for Kartik Aaryan, but now 2023 looks like is even better for him as he kickstarts the year on a super note with Mark's Entertainer written all over his new film Shehzada.
मुंडा सोना मैं कोड़ी तू करोड़ दी, मुंडा सोना मैं कोड़ी तू करोड़ दी, तेरे लिए मैंने पहली वाली छोड़ दी.
A well-timed reference to filmmaker S.S. Rajamouli, to even taking a dig on nepotism.
मॉडल का नाम क्या है? RR. लगता है राजामौली की गाड़ी है. अमीर बच्चों का यही प्रॉब्लम है, लेकिन तेरी गलती नहीं है. तूने खिलौने मांगे, तुझे खिलौने की दुकान मिली. तूने छुट्टे मांगे, तुझे क्रेडिट कार्ड मिला. तूने दूध मांगा, तुझे खीर मिली, वो भी आलमंड मिल्क वाली. भाई इसे कहते हैं नेपोटिज्म.
It's a huge risk to step into the mighty shoes of superstar Allu Arjun, but Kartik Aaryan fits right into this remake of Alavaikan to Perumulu and how.
अब वनवास खत्म, घर लौटने का वक्त आ गया है.
The 3-minute long trailer of this Hindi adaptation of the much-loved Telugu blockbuster has massy action moves with some catchy dialogues and perfect comic timing that will surely tickle your bones.
Hop! Hop! Hop!
रणदीप तुम्हारे पिता, वाल्मीकि तुम्हारा बाप नहीं है. तुम जिद्दल परिवार के शहजादे हो. असली शहजादे.
It summarizes the plot of the film where Karthik's character finds out that he's actually the son of a multi-millionaire played by Ronit Roy and not of a working class man played by Paresh Rawal.
ये स्वर्ग है, यहाँ तक पहुँचने के लिए तुझे बहुत पुण्य करने पड़ेंगे या मरना पड़ेगा.
Upon this discovery, he sets out to claim what he believes is rightfully his.
इतनी एजुकेटेड, टैलेंटेड, डिसिप्लिन, क्यूट, कड़क.
Hello and welcome. The R word looms large over the World Economic Forum at Davos in particular and over the global economy in general. And to talk about what could happen to global growth prospects this year and its impact on the India growth story, I'm joined by one of the world's top economists, the Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Dr. Gita Gopinath. Thank you very much, Dr. Gopinath, for joining us. I want to start by getting you to talk about your sense of the R word and the survey put out by the World Economic Forum of global economists seems to say that 70% of them think that a recession is around the corner this year.
So Rahul, the way I would describe the outlook is that we have a tough year ahead, 2023, but we certainly are seeing signs of resilience around the world. So in terms of a global recession, I think we are still a fair bit away from it. Now, it could happen. We could end up if there were more downside risks that emerged. But in terms of our projections, which we'll actually put the numbers out at the end of this month, we're not in a global recession territory. Now, of course, there are individual countries that are closer to a recession than others are, and that's something that several people are talking about. There's still the war. We still have inflation that's high and monetary policy tightening that continues, and we'll see the consequences of it. So we should see a global economy that slows this year. But by the second half of this year, we expect to see a recovery and then a rebound into 2024. So that's how I would describe the outlook.
But the one other perspective that I'm hearing is that things aren't quite as bad as initially imagined. When people were talking about what might happen in Europe during the winter because of the energy crisis and the manner in which the war was playing itself out, would you say that some of those worst case scenarios haven't really played out and a slowdown, even if it's a sharp slowdown, is more likely than out and out recession?
So that's the part when I said that there are signs of resilience. You're exactly right. I would say compared to our forecasts in October last year, the US and the Europe surprised on the upside. US because labor markets continue to remain strong. Europe because the winter turned out to be warmer than feared. So that has both helped. And then we have China. So China moved dramatically away from its zero COVID policy. So we're going to have a couple of months where things are going to be very tough in China, but then we expect to see a rebound happening in China's economy. So there are certainly some positive turning points, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. I think we still have a difficult time ahead.
The World Bank recently increased India's growth outlook just a little bit, 0.2 from 6.8 to 7, suggesting that things were better than they had initially apprehended. What's your sense of the way the Indian economic growth is panning out at this moment?
So we have the numbers that we put out in December, which is 6.8% for this fiscal year and 6.1% for the next. We're seeing a strong recovery in India. Compared to other countries, we say, it's relatively a bright spot. So I think it's in a good place. And importantly, many countries are looking to India as an investment destination at this point, especially as they try to diversify out of other countries, including China.
Let's talk of China. China opened up all of a sudden, which has created a massive health emergency at this moment. You've tracked the pandemic very closely, so give us your sense of what you think is happening in China and the uptick in Chinese growth. Do you see this as being very short term, or do you think that China will be able to sustain its growth momentum over a longer period of time?
So what we have right now in China is indeed a health crisis with the pandemic going around in full force. If you look at peak infection rates and so on, we're seeing peaks, for instance, happen in Beijing. So the expectation as of now is that much of this will come down by the end of the first quarter, and then we would see a strong recovery in China. So there's going to be just that rebound coming because mobility will come back and restrictions will be lifted. But there are still factors weighing on growth in China, one of which is the property sector. The property sector is in crisis. The government is doing a lot of actions have been taken. Recently, they've announced many measures, so that could help. But that is an important concern. External demand is slowing as the global economy slows, so that obviously has a negative factor for China too. But again, looking into the future, China needs greater productivity growth. It has aging demographics, and we saw the headline today, which is population actually fell in China for the first time. So we need higher productivity growth in China. That requires more private enterprise, a more level, even playing field between the state-owned enterprises and the private enterprises. Again, in December, the authorities came out and said that they were going to focus a lot on growth and on this evenness, but we'll see what exactly is announced in terms of policies, because we haven't seen that yet.
What's your sense of the future of the globalization project? Because with the United States spending so much time on reworking its industrial policy, trying to encourage semiconductors, manufacturing within the United States, do you see a technological Cold War get worse in the months to come?
We've seen signs of technological decoupling between the US and China already. It's been happening these last few years, and given recent policy announcements, I expect that will continue, unless there is a way for the countries, to come back and work even more closely together. We are worried about fragmentation risks in general, in terms of different trading blocs, different trading partners. It's perfectly reasonable for countries to want to have more resilient global supply chains and to build greater national security. I think that's valid concerns. But we are concerned that, in reaction to this, they're going to put policies in place that lead to what we call runaway fragmentation. And that is very costly for the global economy.
Explain why you're so apprehensive. If you're saying it is very costly for the global economy, a lot of people would say, hey, a country like India could potentially benefit from this idea of minilateralism. The fact that there is so much focus on nearshoring and friendshoring at this moment could potentially benefit a country like India at this juncture.
Without a doubt, what the world needs to do is more diversification in where they buy from, right? And in that context, India certainly is can benefit from it. The risk is countries trying to bring all the production home, which is another feature that we're seeing, kind of what's called inshoring, by providing additional subsidies to their own firms and companies to bring production home. The problem with it is that when one country does it, maybe it's beneficial to you, but you're going to have retaliation from the others. And you see that. It usually leads to further trade wars, further retaliation. And then you end up in a world where things are much more costly for consumers and for firms. And we saw that before we saw the increase in trade over the last 30 years or so. So we have to protect the gains that we have from trade and make sure that the policies don't lead to decoupling around the world.
Let's speak about inflation and interest rates. We had the Reserve Bank of India Governor Shaktikanta Das at the Business Today Banking Summit recently, and he spoke about how he thought that interest rates would be high for long. That this idea that interest rates have peaked, he doesn't seem to agree with. His sense is that interest rates would keep rising in the foreseeable future. Do you share that assessment?
To bring inflation down durably, I think we expect that interest rates will have to stay high for a while. The markets think that it's going to come down very quickly. I think we think it's going to take a little longer. Then the question is...
How much longer? Do you have a sense of how long it's
So, for instance, in the U.S., we think that interest rates will have to stay around 5% through 2023. Now, of course, you have to look at incoming data, and you'll have to see what inflation looks like. But as of now, that's where we think it is. And the markets expect that there's going to be a rate cut in 23. So that's inconsistent with Fed communication and what we think. The question then is, what about 3 years later, right? Do we think we're going to be in this high interest rate world? And there, I'm less sure. I think there's a lot of uncertainty. There are forces that go in both directions. It's hard for me to point to strong evidence that says clear signs that we're going to be in a high interest rate environment for the next 5 years. That, I think, is a little more difficult to make.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gopinath. Let me not freeze you any further. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi hit the ground. Right before joining the crucial two-day BJP National Executive Meet, the Prime Minister took out a roadshow in the national capital. While the roadshow itself was short, the messaging around it was loud and clear. The BJP is battle ready for 2024. The hoarding at the venue entrance reflected the BJP's poll plank, Hindutva, Nationalism and Vikas. A series, state elections this year, will set the momentum for the big finale in 2024.
Honorable the party president exhorted all the members of the national executive to be ready with full commitment to ensure that the BJP wins all the 9 assembly polls scheduled for 2023.
The BJP is finalizing its war strategy even as Congress leader Rahul Gandhi is nearing the end of his Kanyakumari to Kashmir Padyatra. The Congress, basking in the Bharat Jodo Yatra's supposed success, called Prime Minister Modi's roadshow a joke.
ये भारत जोड़ो यात्रा का असर है उन पर और आज कुछ 2-3 घंटे के लिए एक छोटा सा रोड शो प्रधानमंत्री ने निकाला है ये दिखाने के लिए कि वो अभी भी लोकप्रिय हैं।
कांग्रेस की हताशा ये बता रही है कि उनके पास और कुछ है ही नहीं। नरेंद्र मोदी जी से तुलना करने के लिए नरेंद्र मोदी जी जैसा सोच होना चाहिए, नरेंद्र मोदी जैसी राष्ट्रभक्ति होनी चाहिए।
While Rahul goes ahead with his yatra, which he says is aimed at uniting the country against hate, his sister Priyanka is canvassing for the Congress in the first big election this year, Karnataka. Fresh from the success in Himachal Pradesh, the Congress leader promised 2,000 rupees per month to each woman head of household if her party wins in Karnataka. Any opposition hope for success in 2024, however, will depend on its unity. So far, they have shown no signs of coming together to take on Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The BJP claims 2024 is a done deal for Modi, who is eyeing a consecutive third term. Bureau Report, India Today.
It's Narendra Modi government versus the Supreme Court once again. Days after the court's critical comments on delay in appointment of judges, Law Minister Kiren Rijiju has written to the Chief Justice of India, D.Y. Chandrachud. In a letter dated 6 January, sources say Rijiju has sought the presence of government nominees in the Search-cum-Evaluation Committee that will provide inputs on suitable candidates to the collegium. The minister adds that in the case of appointment of High Court judges, nominees of state governments should also be included in the panel. The minister's letter has set off a political showdown, with the opposition attacking the BJP for violating the constitution. Minister Rijiju hit back at the opposition, saying his letter was in accordance with Supreme Court's verdict that struck down the National Judicial Appointments Commission Act. The Supreme Court in November and again in December had pulled up the government for this stand, pointing out that only 2 judges in a separate opinion had given the suggestion for a relook. The clear verdict has been to implement the Memorandum of Procedure finalized in 2017. Meanwhile, over 300 vacancies remain in the High Courts and 5 in the Apex Court itself. The opposition is calling the government's intervention a sinister move.
First and foremost, why this concerted, coordinated, sudden action? That question is not answered by anybody. Why suddenly this thing? It's been years since the NJAC judgment. Nothing has happened about the basic structure for decades. Suddenly, why? This hints at a much larger purpose, a control freak purpose, a imposition, dictatorial approach purpose.
The legal fraternity is also unhappy.
The recent communication which has come in the public domain from the Law Minister doesn't appear to be a well understood of the legal position. Either he has not read the judgment, or he's not understood the judgment, or he's being advised wrongly, because clearly the judgment does not entitle the government to ask for amending the collegium itself.
The collegium safeguards the independence of the judiciary. Now, that was sought to be undone by a constitutional amendment by this government. That constitutional amendment was struck down. This also goes against the theory of separation of powers. Can you imagine the law minister then writing, saying that, on all matters where the government is involved, why don't you please seat us on the bench itself?
The law minister's letter has only escalated the face-off between the judiciary and the executive over appointments. With Anisha Mathur in Delhi, Bureau Report, India Today.
It's 2023, and India remains the sole shining star in the global economy. So what lies ahead as the Modi government prepares its last full budget before the 2024 general elections? Join the biggest names in business journalism, decoding the jargon with the biggest newsmakers. From the most credible, in-depth analysis of Budget 2023, turn into Modinomics 2023 through the month. Only on India Today and Business Today Television, gold standard of business journalism.
Co-presented by Star Health Insurance, the health insurance specialist. Co-presented by Panasonic. Create today, enrich tomorrow. Co-powered by Green Lamb Laminates. Kuch Mera, Kuch Tumhara. Co-powered by the bold look of Cola. Co-powered by Samsonite. Tested like Samsonite. Indian Oil. Pehle Indian, phir oil.
Good evening, hello and welcome. You're with the news today, your primetime destination. News, newsmakers, talking point, news without the noise. Tonight, the inequality report.